This video is about developmental science, which will include some of the techniques that we use within developmental science or developmental psychology to understand how people change. Because what developmental psychology fundamentally is the study of how and why people change, or in some cases don't change, over time. There are three major types of research in developmental psychology, and these are actually the same three types of research we see in all forms of psychology. The first, which you may have heard of before, is called descriptive research. Descriptive research are research studies that are meant simply to describe the way that the world works, to describe development. A couple techniques that are used include case studies. A case study is when we focus in on one or two cases really in depth. So instead of having a large sample of participants, we would just have a very small number, but that we would follow this small number of participants extraordinarily closely and take many, many notes and watch them for a long time. We also often use naturalistic observation. Naturalistic observation includes watching how people behave in their natural environment. So in the case of children, naturalistic observation would include things like when researchers go to daycare centers and sit in the corner to watch how many times children hit one another, or how many times boys and girls play together. They're trying not to influence the actual interactions, they're just trying to passively observe them, or observe them naturally. We also sometimes use surveys in descriptive research, or even use surveys in correlational research. Correlations are meant to look at relationships. So for example, if you wanted to know whether age was related to the number of friends you have, you would be asking a correlational question because you said the word related. One isn't causing the other, we're just looking to see, do they work in concert with one another, do they move opposite one another, or are they not related at all? Now, the value that we would get from a statistical test, if you ever were to take stats, is something called the correlation coefficient. So this correlation coefficient would range from -1 to +1, and the great thing about the correlation is that this coefficient tells you a lot about the actual relationship. The sign of the number tells you the direction of the relationship. A negative correlation coefficient says there's a negative correlation or a negative relationship, and that basically means as one variable increases, the other one decreases, or vice versa. So for example, if there was a negative correlation between the age you were and the number of friends you had, that would mean that the older you were, the fewer friends you would have. A positive correlation actually says that things move together, so any correlation value that is a positive number would reflect a positive correlation, meaning that the variables you're looking at would be going either up together or down together. So if you had a positive correlation between age and the number of friends you have, the older you were, the more friends you would have, or the younger you were, the fewer friends you would have. The other thing that we can learn from the correlation coefficient is the strength of relationship. Correlation coefficient values close to 0 are very weak, meaning there's not a relationship. Values that are closer to either -1 or +1 reflect stronger correlations or stronger relationships. So this correlation coefficient value is very useful. It tells us again the strength and the direction of the relationship. So let's look at a couple of examples. Here we have our number scale going from a -1 to a +1 with 0 in the middle. And one example is the amount of time spent in traffic and good mood score. Those are correlated at approximately -0.6. -0.6 would indicate a fairly strong relationship because it's closer to -1 than 0. And the negative value tells us it's a negative relationship. The more time you spend in traffic, the less good mood score you have. At about -0.3 is the relationship between the number of roommates you have and your loneliness score. This is a smaller correlation, but it's not 0, so the fewer roommates you have, the more loneliness a person would have. An example of a non-relationship would be the number of hamburgers eaten and a score on a math test. These are correlated at about 0, which means that they're not related. At +0.3, we have watching violence on TV and later aggressive behavior. This is a real correlation, so the more violent TV a person watches, the more aggressive behavior they engage in. And at about 0.8 is height and weight. The taller a person is, the more they weigh, or the shorter a person is, the less they weigh. And a 0.8 is a very strong correlation. In the real world, this is probably one of the strongest values you would see. Now third, we have the experiments. Experiments are where we can test cause and effect. The reason that we can test cause and effect is because we as researchers will manipulate variables in this study, whereas with descriptive research and correlational research, we're simply measuring, and either to describe or look for the relationship, but we don't manipulate. So let's do an example to show what I mean by manipulation. An example of an experiment might be, does watching violent TV cause violent behavior? We just learned that there is a correlation between the two, but can we use the word cause? In order to do that, we'd have to run an experiment. So we start with a pool of subjects. So let's say we have 100 kids, and we randomly assign our kids to one of two conditions. Conditions is another word for groups. So we have the experimental condition, or the experimental group, and the control group. The experimental group gets the quote-unquote treatment, and the control group doesn't. And what we mean here by treatment is the independent variable. The independent variable is the thing that we want to test. So we're interested, does watching violent TV cause violent behavior? The independent variable here is the violent TV. So the experimental group would get exposed to 3 hours per day of violent TV, and our control group would get 3 hours of non-violent TV. 3 hours just kind of came as an example. You could have chosen any other number. There's nothing special about it. But it is important that both groups watch TV, because you want everything to be exactly the same between the two groups except the thing you're manipulating, and here what we're manipulating is the violence. Because we're interested in does violence impact aggressive behavior would be our dependent variable, the thing on the outcome side. So we might record how many times children hit other kids on recess and have someone sitting in the corner of the playground to count this. If it was the case that our experimental condition children hit each other on an average 5 times during recess, while our control condition hit each other an average of 1 time on recess, we could say that there were differences. And because we manipulated how much violent TV they watched, we could say that watching TV caused this difference in violent behavior. That's how we end up with a causation. We've done this manipulation of the environment and manipulating the independent variable to see if it causes the dependent variable. Now in developmental science, there are a couple other techniques we need to talk about that are specific to development, and that is, how exactly do we study change across time? There's 2 different ways. The first are longitudinal studies, and what happens in a longitudinal study is you study the same participants, which is what P stands for here, the same participants at different time points. So here we have the same person as a baby, and then as a young child, and then as a middle child, and then as a preteen, and a teen, and then a young adult. So basically we would start with a bunch of babies and then maybe measure them every couple of years on whatever variable we were interested in to see how they changed over time. This kind of research takes a really long time to do, as you can see. We have to run the study for 20+ years, but we get a lot of really great information by following the same participants throughout. The other approach is called cross-sectional research, and in cross-sectional studies we could, instead of looking at the same child at all those time ages, just look at a bunch of different kids within each of those time groups. So we could look at a bunch of different infants, and then a bunch of different 2-year-olds, and a bunch of different 5-year-olds, etc. And we could do this all at the exact same time. So I wouldn't have to wait for my infants to become 2-year-olds. I could have one group of infants and another group of 2-year-olds and measure them at the same time. That's a cross-sectional study. Here we have the perk of the research getting done more quickly, but we have the downside of the fact that these people are different. Every person in this study is different, and we don't measure them at multiple time points. Both of these can be helpful. Sometimes we need cross-sectional approaches, and sometimes we need longitudinal approaches. That's the case with the other 3 research strategies I talked about as well. The descriptive research that's meant to describe, the correlational research that's meant to look at the relationship, and then the experimental research, which is meant to test cause and effect. Each has its strengths and each has its weaknesses, and doing a little bit of all kinds of research is always the best approach.